Hey, buddy. How's it going? So, this is Union Hype House. We're all about solidarity and whatnot. We just did our first interview with someone named Richard Winger, who runs ballotaccess.org, which is a website that talks about ballot issues, getting on the ballot, talks a lot about minor parties and third parties in the US and kind of the problems they face getting to you. It talks about some of the flaws that exist in American politics. They got two parties, those are the parties that matter, and nobody cares about all the other ones, despite the fact that a lot of them might mesh well with the American people. So we did a little bit of an interview. This is my first interview. Don't go too hard on me. But let me know what you think. And if you have suggestions for people we should reach out to, let us know. So, welcome to the channel. This is actually going to be the first interview we're doing. Uh, so I heard about your blog, and I'll let you introduce it after. From Ralph Nader, he kind of mentioned that you're the expert on American democracy and how American democracy functions and what kind of the issues are. And I read a bit of your blog, which Ballot Access News is really amazing. But if you want to introduce yourself and plug your blog, that'd be really great.
Well, the subject you, you just described is vast. I certainly don't cover it all. Very unjust in how it treats people who want to participate in political parties other than the Democratic and Republican parties. And the United States is also quite unjust to independent candidates, especially compared to Canada. Canada is a dream for me. So I focus on the problems that people who want to participate in politics but don't want to be Democrats and Republicans have.
Amazing. Okay. So I guess where we can start is I've only read a little bit about the electoral rules of America, but why are American elections so complicated, and why is there such a bias against third parties and independent candidates?
That's a very tough question. Well, as to why it's complicated, that's really a separate question. It's complicated because the United States is a federalist country, so the state governments have a great deal of power over the election rules, even for national elections. And then the United States is also complicated because we have a division of powers, three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. So the voters elect the executive, and the voters elect the legislature, and sometimes the voters put one party in control of the executive branch and another party in control of the legislative branch. So it's very hard to get things done. Canada and Britain, of course, are completely different. The voters choose the parliament, and the parliament chooses the executive. So it's much less work for the voters, and I think it works better in Canada and Britain. As
Yeah.
to why the United States is so hostile to new parties, that's a very tough question. It wasn't true in the 19th century or the 18th century, and back then, four times one of the major parties died out, and another one rose to take its place. So it was possible back then because the government didn't put barriers in the way. But in the 20th century, the old parties have written election laws to make it very hard to dislodge them. I'm just going to shut a door here. I'll be right back.
Feel free.
So I'm back. Go ahead.
Okay. Interesting. So you mentioned how states have a lot of power in these elections. It's interesting because in Canada we have provinces and the federal government, and there's like a slight difference in how they run elections, and at the municipal level there's a little bit more of a difference, obviously. But why? Well, a like why is it set up this way? I mean, I get the federalist idea, but like, how does this nature limit democracy? Like, I would assume that if states have more power, you would get a lot of individual parties kind of popping up in the states, but that doesn't happen. Why do you think that that's the case? What hinders folks so much in various areas?
Well, our U.S. Constitution, ever since the beginning, it was put into effect in 1789. It said the states write the rules for elections, even for congressional and presidential elections. It does say that Congress can step in and supersede state election laws in congressional elections, but it doesn't say that for presidential elections. And if there were one national ballot access law, it would probably be fairly okay. It would probably be just, because whoever wrote it, there'd be a lot of attention on whoever wrote it and passed it, and a lot of pressure to make it a good, fair law. But when all 50 states write their own laws on ballot access, even for presidential elections, there's no common consciousness of what these laws are. It's just a big blur in most people's minds. Most people have no idea how how varied they are and how peculiar they are. And even if they weren't difficult, it would be a problem just because they're all different. And so a nationally organized third party that wants to get on the ballot for president has to understand the procedures in all 50 states, and they're very, very different from each other. In fact, there was a book written by 3 Canadian political scientists called The Rules of the Game. It was a great book. It was a reference book. They put the world's democracies were all in the book, and they put in all their ballot access rules. It was a great book, wonderful book. But for the United States, they just said, we are not including the United States because it's just too hard. The only other country like that is Switzerland. Apparently, in Switzerland, the cantons write the rules also, so they left Switzerland out too.
Interesting. I know a couple of countries who have tried to follow in the United States footsteps, like Pakistan in the 50s and 60s tried to introduce like an electoral college system and tried to follow something similar to American democracy, and it didn't end up working out too well. Okay,
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
recently I saw a Wikipedia article about what are the qualifications to run for president in all the countries that have presidential elections. Well, that was fascinating. About three-fourths of the countries said you have to be age 35 to run for president. Well, they copied that from the United States. That's what we wrote in 1789. I thought,
Yeah,
you're
and
right. It does show how people have tried to imitate us in some ways.
even Canada. I mean, we managed to break through a two-party system, but at one point we're fairly two-party. The Liberals and Conservatives have been the only parties, at least federally, who have secured like full government within Canada. But I mean, we do have a vibrant multi-party democracy, and it does help a lot in terms of ensuring that people are represented and policies are passed that are across the spectrum. So I guess like some of the things that people mention when they talk about American democracy is like gerrymandering, money in politics, and all these kinds of factors. Is that a big part of this? Is it because Democrats and Republicans have held state houses for so long that they can shut out third parties and independents and make it just like harder for them at the state and federal levels?
Yes, when a country's got a very old constitution and old rules, that's a disadvantage. There's a sociological theory called the law of evolutionary potential, and it says when a country almost falls apart and has to start all over, in the long run, that's a good thing. Starting all over, you can clean up the problems. And the United States has been pretty stable for so long that we've just gotten into the rut. It's terribly difficult to change anything. And the Supreme Court could have done a lot more. In the 60s, the Supreme Court of the United States interpreted the equal protection part of the 14th Amendment to insist that every state had to have equal population in its legislative districts. Well, that was revolutionary. Until they did that, you had states where one state Senate district might have 14,000 people and another might have 5 million people. Specifically California.
Oh
That's what our
wow.
state Senate was like. Every county had its own state senator, except if it was a really tiny county, they would lump up to 3 counties. But we had one district with 14,000 population, and then we had Los Angeles County, 5 million people. They all got one state
Oh,
senator. So the Supreme Court fixed that all by themselves. And the Supreme Court could have done a lot more. It's sickening that our current court could have solved the gerrymandering problem. It would have been so easy. They could have just said every state has to have some nonpartisan process for nonpartisan people to draw the districts. But Chief Justice John Roberts, 5-4, said, "Oh, it's impossible to have a fair system, so you can't even go to court over this problem." And there's other problems too.
that doesn't sound just.
Congress tried to fix some of the problems with the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and it worked pretty well. But then the John Roberts Court gutted that too. They said, "Oh, it's not fair because the formula for figuring out which states have to send in their election law changes to the Justice Department is out of date." Well, it was out of date, it's true, but anyway, Congress could have fixed it and they didn't. So we've got so many problems.
Yeah, in theory, like it's kind of a backwards thing, and this exists kind of everywhere. But the election system really needs to be super independent from the political kind of wings. Where it seems like in America there's even more of an overlap where you can appoint Supreme Court justices that are favorable to your cause, and you can change the rules in the various houses. But essentially, like because of how it's designed, like anybody who manages to hold on to power for long enough can greatly influence the rules and shut everybody out.
I once met a visiting delegation of experts from Mexico. They were election experts and they were studying the United States. And they told me of all the things they learned about the United States, the thing that absolutely shocked them was that when we have a board of elections in this country, and some states do and some states don't, only the Democrats and Republicans can have members to it. I thought that was, you know, in Mexico, all the boards of election have all the parties represented.
Oh no, yeah, that would make sense so that everybody can kind of participate and have a voice on whether things are fair. On that note, it's I've read a little bit about the Progressive Party and its various iterations, and I pay a lot of attention to the Green Party as Ralph Nader was a big part of that, and I'm a big Ralph Nader fan. But also the Libertarian Party. I know there's others, but those are the ones I've really focused on. All of them have been shut out in various ways. Like you mentioned, it's impossible unless you really have done this for a long time. It's impossible to figure out and make sure you get on all the ballots. But it seems like there's other ways that these parties are shut out from the national conversation, from the televised debates, or like they don't have nearly enough money. You need to get at least 5% voter turnout to qualify for federal funding. So that means the only two parties that get federal funding right now are the Republicans and Democrats, which seems very backwards.
Yes, it's a little complicated. There's two kinds of public funding of presidential campaigns in the United States. There's primary season matching funds, which is fairly reasonable. The Green Party has had several presidential nominees who got primary season matching funds. And although it's not a lot of money, that helped them a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Set that aside, then there's general election funding, which is exactly what you said. It's only for parties that pulled 5% of the vote in the last election. And what dismays me is that right now, both the Senate and the House have got bills number one. They consider that the most important bill, H.R. 1 and S1. And those bills change election laws and they make things worse for third parties. They are ruining the primary season matching funds program and making it 10 times harder to get the money. So here's the little bit of public funding that the minor parties get in this country, and they're going to take it away unless we can make a fuss about it, perhaps stop it. The press isn't even mentioning this.
Right. So this is both Democrats and Republicans, right? Like some folks think that only the Republicans engage in this kind of like party or voter suppression. But it sounds like the Democrats engage in it just as much.
They do. In 2020, the Democratic Party kept the Green Party off the ballot for president in 3 states in the most unjust manner. I'll just take a minute to talk about what happened in Montana. The Green Party in 2018 tried to get on the ballot in Montana. It couldn't quite get the needed signatures, so the Republican Party helped them out. Well, this made the Democrats feel that the Green Party was totally illegitimate, and they, even though the Secretary of State said they had enough signatures in 2018, the Democrats sued the Secretary of State to prove they didn't, and they found a few more invalid signatures and they threw them off. So in 2020, it happened again. This time, the Secretary of State said they had way over what they needed. The Secretary of State, who was a Republican, put him on the ballot, held a primary for him. 3 months later, the Democrats went around, they got a list of all the people that signed the petition for the Green Party, and they knocked in their doors and said, oh, did you know the Green Party is just a puppet of the Republican Party? Please sign this form taking your name off the Green Party petition. And they would come back and back and back, and finally they got enough people to take their names off. And there was not even any procedure in the law for a person to subtract their signature from the party like that. They just made it up. But the courts in Montana, they threw them off. So that's twice in a row. And I've talked long enough, but the same thing, equally unfair, happened in Wisconsin, and almost as unfair in Pennsylvania.
Well, we're here to listen, so you can expand anytime you want to. But that's brutal. And this is a super. So lawsuits are a super common tactic from what I've been reading on your blog as well. So oftentimes, like the Republicans will target the Libertarians because they think the Libertarians will take away from them, and the Democrats will target the Greens, but also just shut them out of every option. What are some other lawsuits that really shocked you when you read about them? You can be as historical as you want with them.
Well, first I want to say it's not really balanced the way you implied.
Mm,
The Republicans have very, very seldom tried to keep libertarians off the
okay.
ballot, whereas the Democrats have a long history of it. The Democrats tried to keep Congressman William Lemke off the ballot in 1936. He was the Union Party,
Oh.
because they were worried about that, taking the votes. In 1948, they tried to keep Henry Wallace off the ballot. He had been vice president. He
Yeah.
had started his own party called the Progressive Party.
Destroyed his career, ruined his
And,
life.
and in 1952, they again kept the Progressive Party off the ballot in Illinois anyway. Then in 1976, they tried to keep independent candidate Eugene McCarthy off the ballot in certain states. And in 1980, they tried to keep independent John Anderson off the ballot in several states. And then the worst of all was 2004, when Ralph Nader was an independent, and they sued to keep him off the ballot in 2/3 of the states where he filed. It was terrible. There's just no comparison in U.S. history to what they tried to do to Ralph Nader in 2004. Now, Nader did win most of his cases, but he ended up only in the ballot with 50% of the population.
Interesting.
So
And
it's not the Republicans. This is one of the rare areas where the Republicans are better in voting rights than the Democrats.
interesting. That's really good to know because what I had read had implied that there was like a balance there. So it's really interesting to hear that there isn't. That's completely wild. So it sounds like the Democrats have a long history, a long history of this, beyond comparable to anything else. The 2004 case. I'm currently reading a book called Independent Politics that was written by the Green Party candidate Howie Hawkins, about the Green Party in general, and touches on this, but I haven't done any substantial research on it. So I'm super new to this. This is while I've done some academic research on this is the first more in depth dive on it. So anytime I say something that might not be correct, please correct us because we got to make sure people are informed.
Well,
Okay,
since you said it's okay to keep talking about this, I'll just tell you about Wisconsin
of
2020.
course.
The uh, the Green Party only needed 3,000 signatures in Wisconsin. No, 2,000. Sounds easy, right? Well, it was easy. I mean, they got plenty more than they needed. But the trouble was their vice presidential nominee had moved right in the middle of the petition drive. So since she was moving, she was honest. They asked the Wisconsin Board of Elections, well, what should we do? Should we start the petition drive all over again with her new address? And they said, no, it's okay. Just turn in the old ones with the old address and the new ones with the new address. It'll be fine. Well, it wasn't fine. They threw him off the ballot because of that. Even though, and at the hearing, they wouldn't even let the Green Party representative talk more than 10 minutes, and they wouldn't let her have rebuttal time. It was the Wisconsin Election Commission that was doing this. Now, there's 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, but unfortunately, the chair was a Democrat, and she was running things. So that's why Howie wasn't on the ballot in Wisconsin. It was a
Brutal.
shame because Wisconsin had a great historical record. Wisconsin had never before kept anybody of any importance at all off their ballot for president.
Mm.
It completely flew in the face of Wisconsin tradition.
There was clear suppression in the last election. Like the presence of the Green Party was historically low, as was the Libertarian Party. They were given no media time. They didn't seem to have any presence. And were I had read on your blog actually that they were pushed out of a lot of states. I couldn't tell you the whole list, but it didn't sound like they were given much of space anywhere or any kind of platform.
Yes, Joe Jorgensen, the Libertarian presidential nominee, she, she only got publicity in the general media when a bat bit her. And she had to take a little break from campaigning. That's about it. I mean, after the election, she got a lot more publicity.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well because if you follow like some of the new youth media like TikTok or whatnot, a lot of the things that folks on who were either voting Democrat or were supporting Joe Biden, despite not agreeing with a lot of his politics, a lot of the politics that they reflected in other parts of their like a lot of their other views were reflected in the Green Party, and the even for some of the folks who were supporting the Republicans, like a lot of them and a lot of their views were more reflected in the Libertarian Party. But they had just no like somebody made a joke about how Howie Hawkins represented what all the youth were saying Joe Biden was, when in fact like Joe Biden had none of the views that they thought he did, which was very interesting in how that narrative was shaped.
Well, it's hard to tell about Joe Biden. I mean, he has done something useful in the climate area already.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's too early to characterize him, I think.
Yeah, and his platform, I do agree with a lot of folks who said his platform, and maybe you let me know if I'm wrong on this, but I have heard and read that the Democratic platform has been one of the most progressive, if not the most progressive platform to come out of the Democratic Party ever. And canceling Keystone XL, a lot of people thought he was going to get pressured into not doing it. Some folks thought that he should have given direct to like $2,000 checks instead of 1,400 because it was like 600 plus 1,400. But that seemed to be more of a miscommunication. Potentially, like maybe not people who were on the ground in Georgia not fully understanding the promise. That always happens in election campaigns where your volunteers are saying one thing, but it doesn't exactly reflect the reality of what you're proposing. But yeah, no, there was a lot of good on day one. I mean, it would have been nice to include some of these election issues, but it does sound like this is still a historic shift, even between Trump and Biden. Like a lot of people thought that it would be more of the same, which in some ways, depending on how you view politics and how you view the issues, there's going to be a lot of carryover, but in general, there is definitely a marketed shift.
Yeah, I wish Biden would address specifically that he wants unity. He acts like there's nothing but Democrats and Republicans, and when he talks
Mm.
about unity, I'm glad he talks about unity. I like that, but he will just talk about unity between Democrats and Republicans. I wish he would say not only independents, libertarians, Greens. You know, Ronald Reagan did that
Mm.
when he went to the Soviet Union while he was president. He gave a talk in Russia in the Soviet Union, and he said, you know, we in the United States have a socialist party and a libertarian party. We have more than just two parties. I do not know of any other president that ever said that in modern times, anyway.
Okay, so that's a really good segue. What do you think are some of the solutions? I know you've mentioned kind of like a more central uh, federal law or state or elections law that kind of lays it out and evens out the playing field across the board. But what other kind of solutions do you think exist out there for America to take on?
Well, to help debates, there is a lawsuit pending in the U.S. Supreme Court right now called Level the Playing Field versus Federal Election Commission. It's a strong case and it has a lot of strong backers. And it's conceivable that our Supreme Court will take this case and do something useful to break the monopoly that the Democratic and Republican parties have in the general election presidential debates. I admired Canada so much. I saw a debate in Canada with 5 party leaders participating. I saw one in Great Britain with 7 party leaders participating. I just wish the United States could get up to your guys' level. And as far as ballot access, well, we would have better luck in court if we got a positive signal from the U.S. Supreme Court. But the U.S. Supreme Court has not taken any case brought by a minor party or independent over ballot access since 1991.
Mm.
30 years. They've turned away all of our appeals since then, hundreds of them. And but hope springs eternal, and we've got a couple more sitting there. So maybe we'll have a miracle and we'll get some help from the U.S. Supreme Court. That'll only ring 3 times and it'll stop.
No worries, we can wait.
So I was finished with my thought.
That's a classic ringtone. My old home phone
Real
had that too.
fast.
I support it. The only other thing I wanted to touch on was something I was reading on your blog was around somehow petitions only count if there are registered voters who sign them. So even if I was petitioning and I wanted to run for something in certain areas, I would have to knock on doors, and if someone wasn't a registered voter, they wouldn't count on this petition. How widespread is that? Because that must quadruple the amount of work you have to do in order to get on a ballot.
Yeah, that's the norm in almost every state.
Okay.
So petitioners frequently, when they get hold of their petition, they think it's done. They will ask the government for a list of the registered voters, and they will check their own petition before they turn it in, just to see how they did. And if they need more, they'll go out and get more. Now, we had a legal marijuana now party in Nebraska, and it spent a year getting its signatures, and it turned them in September 2020, and the government said it was too busy to check them until January this month,
Mm.
and they said, sorry, you're 26 signatures short.
Oof.
And we're not going to permit you to go out and, even though the deadline is not until next year, we're not going to permit you to go out and get any more signatures. That's what's rotten. There's no rational reason why, if they reject your petition, assuming it's not up to the deadline, okay, go out and get some more. So yeah, we have all these problems.
Ideally, um, there was a case in New York that you mentioned. I'm just going to quickly check it. That boiled down to like 70 signatures. Is that accurate? This is a
Oh, yeah, it's not rare at all. Sometimes people miss by two or three signatures. Usually, though, if you only miss by a handful, you can you can say, "Look here, let's look at this again." Say you threw out this signature, but I found it here in the list of registered voters. You just made a mistake, and the government will say, "Oh, yep, so sorry, we made a mistake. You can have
hmm,
that one." So you can work to revalidate. That's what the Legal Marijuana Now Party is doing in Nebraska right now. That's all they can do. They're going through every signature that was thrown out. They lost a whole page of signatures because it wasn't notarized,
uh,
but the notary had COVID or something, and so they're trying to persuade the Secretary of State to let that page be notarized late. So there's all these little possibilities for hope. The very idea that you have to get a petition notarized is absurd anyway. I mean, all the notary can do is prove that the person who circulated the petition is who he or she said. But so what? In fact, there's a few states where they don't even care who circulated the petition. You can put it up on a bulletin board and nobody's around and people can come and sign it, and that's okay. But there's only about 10 states like that. Most states are very fussy about wanting to know who circulated it.
right. I mean, I read one of the papers on your website that said that in the early days, political parties themselves put out the ballots. In the early days of
Right.
the union.
That was before 1889.
Hmm.
Um, there were no government printed ballots. That's one of the reasons we had so much more freedom in the 19th century. There was no way the government could prevent anybody from running for any office they wanted because the government had nothing to do with printing the ballots. Voters
Hmm.
could make their own ballot, but generally the party would print up a ballot just listing its own nominees, and it would hand it out to people that wanted it. And I
Right.
was just reading a book about the old ballots, and I found out in Kentucky until 1870 they didn't permit paper ballots at all. Until 1870 in Kentucky, all voting was oral. You showed up at the polling place and you said who you were voting for.
In the
So
style
there
of the
was
Romans.
secret ballot in those days.
Okay, so there's been a clear evolution. There's still a lot of problems. It sounds like, but you have hope, and that's good to hear.
Well, I guess everybody needs hope. You can't, social activists can't really do any work if they don't have hope. Don't you
Yeah,
agree?
I
In
do.
every area.
I mean, a lot of people in my generation are super cynical, and it's very hard to deal with. So, I've been sharing a lot about optimism and hope these days because, like, so many people have just give. I've seen so many activists who have done really good work, who have shown up and who have put in a lot of time, just give up because they get overwhelmed, and then there's no hope and optimism because everybody's so cynical.
That's right. And then that's how people defeat themselves.
Hmm.
If you don't try, you're sabotaging yourself.
Yeah, and it's all in the long term. Like you got to put in a lot of time to make these things happen. It's not going to change overnight.
Hmm. That's right. It's very incremental. We have improved a lot of ballot access laws in the past 30 years, mostly by persuading state legislatures that it's the right thing to do. So when people understand that that does work sometimes, it can go ahead. But when people are persuaded it's hopeless, then they don't try and nothing good happens.
Absolutely. Well, those are all the questions I have. Is there anything you want to plug? Is there anything you want to mention before we kind of wrap up? I'll let you give a conclusion as you see fit.
Honestly, I think you did an excellent job of asking questions that pulled out of my head the things I wanted to say. So I can't think of a thing, which proves you did a good job.
And so we'll give the website again. So Mr. Richard Winger, ballot-access.org. There's fourth over almost 5,000 pages of news on American ballot information, which I haven't read through all 4,900 yet, but soon. This is such
Well,
a valuable
know that.
resource.
Thank you. All
Anytime.
right. It's great being on your show.
Likewise, thank you
Okay.
so